Hello, this is Garth Noyes. Sometime in late 2015, under the pseudonym G.K. Flint, I released the first episode of A History of the King James Bible podcast. The genesis, no pun intended, of the series occurred in 2011 on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version of the Bible. At that time, I went looking for a podcast series about the King James Version and found while there were a few standalone releases, there was no in-depth series about this most important book. I thought to myself, someone should do that. At the time, I didn't think that person would be me. A few years later, I again went online looking for a series concerning the history of the King James Version of the Bible. It still hadn't been done, so I thought, I'm going to have a crack at it. I then gathered some resources, did the research, and hit record. Over the course of about 18 months, beginning in late 2015, I released 22 episodes of the series, the final episode being released in June 2017. Since its release, I have received the occasional email from listeners, some to thank me for the series, and others asking if there will be further episodes. I have no plans to add to the series, but I thought perhaps I should share the series on YouTube so that others might have a chance to hear it. Which brings us to October 2020, and the series now being made available on YouTube. Any references to the now defunct website or different email addresses can be ignored as you go through the series. If you do wish to contact me, you can email me at gkjames1611@gmail.com. That's gkjames1611 gkjames1611@gmail.com. I will check this email intermittently, so please be patient if you do write. I have already stated the reason I decided to create this series, but my research into the translators unquestionably motivated me to get the research down and to hit record. It is clearly my favourite part of this work, so I am now thrilled anew in October and November of 2020 to offer on YouTube my study on the translators of the King James Bible. So here now for your enjoyment is my original series, A History of the King James Bible podcast.
Welcome, friends, to A History of the King James Bible podcast. To find more episodes and information, just go to our website, www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now here is GK with the latest episode.
Well, welcome to another episode of A History of the King James Bible podcast. This is episode 9, and we will call this episode The First Westminster Company. In this episode, we take our first look at the translators of the King James Version. Who were they, and what kind of lives did they lead? I think all of us would know that they must have been scholars of some sort, but what sort? Were they all experts in all the same languages? Did any of their expertise go beyond linguistics? Were they family men? Were they paid? That's a good question. Were they old? Were they young? Or whatever. Perhaps one of the most obvious questions is, why were those who worked on the task chosen to do so? Can we know? Also, will I find anything controversial about any of them? These are just some of the questions I pondered and set out to answer. My plan is to do the best I can to introduce you to every single one of the King James Bible translators. Not all in one episode, of course. So let's get started. Let's meet our first 10 translators. Each one is interesting in their own right. We're going to hear about a runaway bride, a translator who enjoyed a tipple as much as his king, a man who would be seen by some as well past his retirement age, and we're going to hear about a man who you may not have heard of before, but he stands alongside of Shakespeare and Bacon as one of the top, if not the top, intellectual mind of the time. He was a scholar and a linguist. And like I say, he was probably the top intellectual at the time, in the English-speaking world, I should add. He was a man skilled in 15 languages, and he was also the premier translator of the King James Version. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, getting a bit excited. After we met our first group of translators, we're going to have a very brief look at some of their work. Just a quick look at some of the things they did. We'll get into much more of that further down the track. Okay, so let's get started. The Dean of Westminster and the Regius Professors of Cambridge and Oxford were asked to draw up a list of translators. A Regius Professor is a university professor with royal patronage or appointment. Now, there was to be no pay, as James was basically broke at this point in time, but those who were chosen were to be offered ecclesiastical preferment. So the word went out to find appointments for them to the value of about £20. We might now discuss briefly the 6 different companies of translators before we go on to talk about individual translators. I want to remind you at this point that my study of the translators some years ago is the reason I decided to produce this series. So I'm going to be spending some time on this topic. I will, however, in later episodes, discuss the process and the outcome of the work. Let's talk numbers. Reading from McGrath now, and please, as usual, I'll remind you to see the references section of the website, as you may yourself be interested in tracking down some of these books that I've read and used in this series for yourself. They definitely make interesting reading, and I recommend every single one of those that I have used. James directed that the entire text of the Bible was to be divided into 6 sections, with roughly the same number of men allocated to the translation of each section. 2 were assigned to meet at Westminster, 2 at Oxford University, and 2 at Cambridge University. The first group of 3 companies were assigned the Old Testament, and a second group of 2 the New Testament. A 6th group was entrusted with the apocryphal works. When each section had completed its tasks, 12 delegates were to be chosen, 2 from each company from the entire body of translators. These would meet together to review and revise the entire work. Finally, the finishing touches would be applied to the work by the bishops of Winchester and Gloucester. Though Bancroft appears to have drawn no attention to the fact, he had reserved for himself the privilege of making revisions to what all had hitherto thought of as the final draft. Careful study of the various lists of translators shows that the maximum number of 54 translators specified by James was not achieved. In his magisterial study, The History of the Reformation of the Church of England, Gilbert Burnet, 1643 to 1715, identifies only 47 names. Other lists allow up to 51 to be identified. The traditional explanation for the inconsistency may well be correct. It is suggested that early deaths led to the number of translators being reduced from the original intention of the king. Another explanation is offered by the 15th of Bancroft's translation rules, which allows for 3 or 4 additional persons to be allocated as required to the translation teams. This suggests that a translation team of 50 or 51 was appointed, on the assumption that 3 or 4 others would be called upon as required. Now, before we move on, I'll just briefly tell you what the 6 companies were to translate, what their assignments were, and then we will move on to talk about individual translators. But we will probably come back to this as we go along. You'll pick it up as we go along, but I think it's worth noting here. Okay, so the first Westminster Company, their role was to translate the Old Testament, Genesis to 2 Kings. The first Cambridge Company, their assignment was 1 Chronicles to the Song of Songs. The first Oxford Company, their assignment was Isaiah to Malachi. So you see the 3 different teams. The first company from each team was given a part of the Old Testament. Now we'll look at the second companies. The second Oxford Company, their role was the 4 Gospels, Acts and Revelation. The second Westminster Company was the New Testament letters. And the second Cambridge Company was the Apocrypha, the apocryphal books. So that is the assignments for the 6 companies. Now, let's do something I've been waiting 8 or 9, no, hang on, what are we up to? Nine episodes to get around to. Let's meet one of our friendly translators. This guy is actually a very amazing person. I want to introduce you to the head of the first Westminster Company. And as we pointed out earlier, the first Westminster's task was to translate Genesis to 2 Kings, and the head of the company was Lancelot Andrewes. He was the Dean of Westminster Abbey at the commencement of the translation. Andrewes was a senior-ranking churchman in the Anglican Church, having served during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, before James came to the throne in England. Andrewes was held in such high regard with regard to academic pursuits that more than once he was to assist King James with his own writing. Andrewes was born in 1555 near Allhallows, not far from the Tower of London. In 1571 he attended Cambridge and attained a Bachelor of Arts, followed by a Master of Arts, and in 1580 he became an ordained priest. Very early on he was singled out for attention because of his academic qualities. I'll just point that out here. He attended Pembroke College at Cambridge on a scholarship under the patronage of Walsingham, a former neighbour of his family's back at Allhallows. This Walsingham was none other than Sir Francis Walsingham, chief spy and head of espionage under Queen Elizabeth. Do you remember we spoke about his involvement in the bringing down of James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots? Well, not the bringing her down so much as, leading her to her final execution. You can hear about that in the first couple of episodes of this series. So go back and have a listen if you'd like to catch up on that. But suffice it to say, to trap Queen Mary, or Mary Queen of Scots, you could say that Walsingham had a cunning plan. So back to Lancelot. Lancelot Andrewes held a number of church and academic positions before rising to become the Dean of Westminster at the time of the translation, and in 1605 he became the Bishop of Chichester. It will come as no surprise to you if you have listened to early episodes of this program that he was well appreciated by James, since he often preached on the divine right of kings. If there was one way for anyone to win brownie points with His Majesty, this would be it. Indeed, in this period, Andrewes was James's favourite preacher. James rarely missed his sermons, James having been present at all of Andrewes' Christmas sermons. Andrewes would also preach every 5th of November on the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot. So you can go back to earlier episodes to hear about that too. So remember the 5th of November. And the only time that James and Queen Anne missed the 5th of November sermon was at the death of their son, Prince Henry. Let me share a brief anecdote to demonstrate just a little of their relationship. So reading from Stuart's Cradle King, which you can find the details about in the reference section on the website, this little anecdote is a bit of a hoot. Let me just find it here for you. On 29 May 1624, James prorogued Parliament, promising to recall it towards the winter. The session ended with another display of royal anger, as James launched into a tirade against the Commons and, more problematically, refused to give his assent to a number of bills. James had claimed that the restitution of the Parliament was the only valid reason to declare war, and insisted that this be included in the preamble to the subsidy bill. Seeing that the Commons had refused to do so, James asserted his right to alter it and set his marginal note upon it. On the day Parliament was prorogued, James dined, as he did frequently, with Lancelot Andrewes, now Bishop of Winchester, and Neil, Bishop of Durham, on hand to provide learned discourse. Parliament's intransigency was playing on James's mind. He asked whether or not he could take the money of his subjects without parliamentary sanction. Neil replied readily, "God forbid, sir, but you should. You are the breath of our nostrils." Andrewes was more equivocal. "Sir, I have no skill to judge of Parliament." "No put-offs, my lord," exclaimed the king, Answer me presently." "Then, sir," replied Andrewes, "I think it's lawful for you to take my brother Neil's money, for he offers it." The bishop's rejoinder provoked laughter, but not from the king, who realised the wisdom behind the wit. Now, we haven't yet covered the death of King James, but on his deathbed, it was Andrewes who he called for. And, even though he was known to sometimes snooze through a sermon at church, James sometimes slept with one of Andrewes' sermons under his pillow. Isn't that something? Let's move on before I steer us back to more on James, but I felt I had to share these few tidbits to demonstrate the high regard which James held for Andrewes. Not that they did not have their differences. Let's see how far we can get now before we mention James again. So let's turn to Opfal's book, the King James Bible Translators. If you're keen being like me about this topic, try and get a hold of this book. It can be hard to find and it can be expensive, but I think it's worth it if you're interested in the topic. As I read some portions here from Opfal, take note of the esteemed men and women with whom Andrewes was associated. Okay, let's go to Opfal. Like his own king, Lancelot Andrewes was a formidable scholar, even surpassing his sovereign in the mastery of languages. Acquiring a new one each year for a considerable period, he finally learned 15 so well that Thomas Fuller, the church historian, hailed him as one so skilled in all, especially Oriental, languages that some considered he might, if then living, have served as interpreter general at the confusion of tongues. That's a bit of a hoot if you think about it. Still more, Fuller commented, "The world wanted learning to know how learned this man was." Andrewes was also celebrated for his vast patristic learning, his magnificent grasp of the writings of Christian teachers between the 1st and 8th centuries. Such studious achievements helped forge an intimate friendship between him and Isaac Casaubon, the famous Swiss-French classical scholar. Hugo Grotius, the renowned Dutch legal scholar, counted a meeting with Andrewes one of the special attractions of a visit to England. Appointed catechist at Pembroke in 1580, after taking holy orders, Andrewes began giving Saturday and Sunday afternoon lectures which were attended and carefully noted down by all who had any pretensions to the study of divinity. In these lectures he frequently espoused the Puritan doctrine of Sabbatarianism, or strict observance of Sunday. He associated with such Puritans as Lawrence Chatterton, John Newstubbs, and Chatterton's brother-in-law, Ezekiel Culverwell. His patron Walsingham was championing the Puritans at court. As his renown increased, Andrewes became chaplain successfully to the Earl of Huntingdon and John Whitgift, Archbishop of Canterbury, and finally chaplain in ordinary to the Queen. That'll be Queen Elizabeth I. After he had accepted favours from Whitgift and the Queen, he severed his Puritan associations. He had received the degree of Doctor of Divinity in 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada. For the charm of his delivery he was called an angel in the pulpit. As this pulpit style drew him into the larger world, he became, through the good offices of Walsingham, rector of St. Giles's, Cripplegate, in 1589. Here, his overpopulated parish contained noblemen, paupers and players, and minstrels from the Fortune and Red Bull theatres. And here he buried Sir Martin Frobisher, one of the most famous navigators of the Elizabethan era. In 1590, while keeping the St. Giles benefice, he returned to Cambridge as master of Pembroke Hall. During his tenure there, he stopped the college deficits and increased the endowments. He had additional duties in London, for in the same year he was appointed prebendary and residentiary of St. Paul's Cathedral, then prebendary of Westminster in 1591. A prebendary was the holder of a cathedral benefice, and his prebend usually consisted of revenue from one manor of the cathedral estates. Among the enthusiastic listeners to Lancelot Andrewes' sermons at St. Paul's, and possibly at St. Giles, were Thomas Nash, the playwright, and John Lilly, whose own eupheistic literary style may have inspired Andrewes. At Westminster, Andrewes the prebendary showed up at only 13 chapter meetings out of a possible 33. But after Elizabeth appointed him dean in 1601, he attended strictly to his duties. One of his prebendaries was Richard Hakluyt, otherwise known as the father of English geography and the author of The Principal Navigations. As dean, Andrewes preached the funeral sermon when Queen Elizabeth was buried amid great pomp in Westminster Abbey. As Dean of Westminster, Andrewes was the official head of the ancient Westminster School, a stone's throw from the Abbey, where for the 120 boys in their sombre russet gowns, classes began at 5 and ended at 8, with only a few interludes of rest. Customarily, the dean met the boys at mealtimes. Often, it was said, he sent for the upper-class scholars to his lodgings at night and kept them with him from 8 to 11, unfolding to them the best rudiments of the Greek tongue and elements of the Greek grammar. He was skilled as well in Hebrew, Syriac and Chaldaic. Now I'll just skip on here a bit. With his standing at court more enhanced than ever, Andrewes climbed swiftly toward the top, eventually becoming Royal Almoner, member of the Court of Star Chamber and of the Privy Council, and Dean of the Chapel Royal at Whitehall. He was consecrated Bishop of Chichester in 1605. Next he moved on to Ely, 1609, and finally to Winchester in 1619. During this period he became fast friends with John Chamberlain, known to posterity as the best letter writer of the Jacobean age. In one letter to his chief correspondent, the diplomat Dudley Carleton, Chamberlain praised the Bishop of Ely. "Surely he hath a wonderful memory, for he not only calls to mind any matter that passed at any time, but the very time, place, persons, and all other circumstances." So really, when you're a languages person, which I'm obviously not, but when you are, I think, memory is very, very helpful when you're learning them. So it's, we read earlier that he knew 15 languages and some he knew intimately. So this guy's commenting about his memory. I'm not surprised that he had a very good one. Andrewes, however, was most often in London. As a bishop, he was a member of the House of Lords. The Bishop of Winchester had Winchester House as his town residence, and was therefore resident landlord of the Southwark area, which contained theatres, brothels, and Paris gardens, notable for bull and bear baiting. Rising in the ranks, Andrewes was increasingly praised for his scholarly piety and his keen, grave zeal, his attachment to the words of Scripture, his heavy oaken eloquence. Ely and Winchester were especially wealthy and important sees. One writer sums up his intense activity. Over the years, from his catechetical instruction at Pembroke to his death in 1626, he delivered hundreds of lectures and sermons, served in numerous official capacities, acted as spiritual guide and counsellor to all who sought his advice, consulted with recusants, attended the king at court, and on his progress through the realm, administered his successive dioceses, and withal managed to lead a life of prayer and study. Okay, so there's our introduction to Lancelot Andrewes, whose work on the King James Bible looms large, and as you heard through there, he's certainly rose through the ranks to hold some very high positions, both in the church and in the government under James. And in my opinion, he's as important to the work of the King James Bible as King James and Bancroft were. 15 languages, think about that. He's the man you want to go to. I read somewhere that he was in the top 3 of linguists, I think, in the universe at that time, in his day. And when it came to translating a known language, Lancelot Andrewes was the go-to man. I would bet right here and now, pounds to peanuts, that we get to talk about Andrewes again in this series. But anyway, so there's our first introduction to one of the translators.
You're listening to a History of the King James Bible podcast with GK. The series is now available on iTunes. Just go to iTunes and search for a History of the King James Bible podcast with G.K. Flint as the author. If you enjoy this series, please leave a rating and a review. You can also find links to every episode at our website. Just head to www.ahistoryofthekingJamesBiblePodcast.com. Now let's get back to this episode with your host, GK.
I just want to take a moment to say thank you to those of you who have written to me since the last episode. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate that. If you haven't yet written to me, please take the time and let me know what you think of the series. I want to say a special good day for my old China plate Adam over there in WA, and that's Western Australia, not Washington State. Thanks for your encouragement and prayers, mate. I appreciate that. I also remind you that every episode of this series is available and provided free. I've got nothing to sell, and I don't have a donation button on the website. If you like the series, please share the series. Now, let's get back to this episode of the History of the King James Bible podcast. Okay, so let's meet the rest of the First Westminster Company. John Overall, another dean, this time of St. Paul's Cathedral, was almost as unpopular with King James as Lancelot Andrewes was in favour with him. Why? Well, we've already talked about it in this episode, in the oppositional point, and I've mentioned it many times in this series. John Overall did not quite agree with the ideal of the divine right of kings to rule. Indeed, he had written that following a revolution, the new government is entitled to claim the obedience of the people, and this as a duty to God. James suppressed the book that had discussed the matter. I'm smiling here, I can't help myself. Good old James. Born in 1560 in Suffolk, Overall was orphaned at a young age. He had gone to school with John Boyce, another translator who ended up in the Second Cambridge Company, and together they entered Cambridge, where Andrew Downes, yet another future translator in the Second Cambridge Company, was head lecturer in Greek. Later, at Trinity College, Overall became Prolector of Greek and later Regius Professor of Divinity. Now, I had to look this up, but at Cambridge, a Prolector is the fellow of a college who formally presents students during their matriculation and the graduation ceremony, especially during the congregation of the Regent House when degrees are conferred. I like this bit here. The Prolector is also vicariously responsible for a student's actions and can be punished for those actions. Now, Overall was also an expert in Latin, having once spoken so much Latin he began to have trouble with the English. Now, as you will remember, the First Westminster Company was given the task of translating Genesis to 2 Kings, and I've read that Overall was no expert in Hebrew. So why was he placed in this company? It seems he was chosen for the job because they were expected to consult some Latin works, and an expert in the language such as Overall was needed. Let's read a little more from Opfel. This portion describes why many churchmen of the time were criticised for the way they went about receiving their incomes. Then we're going to talk about a very personal issue that Overall dealt with at the time. Overall was one of those criticised as a plural parson with several incomes. In 1603 and 1604, he got the livings of Clothall and Thurfield in Hertfordshire, both served by less educated curates at small salaries. A living was a church with an attached income, which might come from the glebe, that's the parsonage lands, or from tithes, tenths of crops, farm animals, poultry, eggs or vegetables. A rector received all the tithes, a vicar only part of them. Livings were awarded by the Crown, the bishops, the colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, or lords of the manor. The biggest livings, to be sure, were prebendal stalls, deaneries and bishoprics, which usually went to the friends of great men. Overall also held the living of Albuquerque and Lincolnshire. Later he became Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield and Bishop of Norwich 6 years before his death. Now, I read that to point out why at this point in time a lot of the churchmen were criticised because as it put it here, they were plural parsons and they had more than one stream of income, and that was looked down upon by some of those that struggled. You know, good preachers and good churchmen, and I'd guess even the Puritans had something to say about it as well. You know, that there were good preachers who could do with a bit of a living, yet there were some who were taking the living, you know, of perhaps 2 or 3 or more. One sad event in Overall's life was when his wife left him for another man. A noted beauty of the time, Anne overall ran away with Sir John Selby, but as the story goes, she was forcibly returned to St. Paul's, where she remained with her forgiving husband. This episode led to a couple of suggestive rhymes which did the rounds back in the day. Keep in mind, this is the Dean of St. Paul's wife, so the wags had a field day with it. You might question why I'm reading these, but I really just want to give you a taste of the reality that the translators faced. This is not something I would normally want to go into, but, I think we need to be mature about it and look at it and say, well, hey, these guys were flesh and blood and dealt with real life issues like many of us do today. And that's the reason I really wanted to look deeply into the lives of the translators. Okay, so one of the rhymes went like this. The Dean of St. Paul's did search for his wife, and where do you think he found her? Even upon Sir John Selby's bed, as flat as any flounder. Another one, all be updated, that I seem to recall portions of from my childhood when kids told dirty jokes when they snuck a cigarette behind the bike shed at school, went like this. Face she had of filbert hue, and bosomed like a swan. Back she had of bended yew, and wasted by a span. Hair she had as black as crow, from her head unto her toe. Down, down all over her, hey nonny, nonny, no. The one I recall was perhaps a little bluer, but you get the point, I'm sure. Despite our view of the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages as being all very highbrow, I think some of us would be surprised to know that it could be rather crude, and I've read somewhere that even James himself wasn't all manners. In fact, he could be quite the opposite. And remember, he was the king. It's good to be the king. Moving on swiftly now. I want to introduce you to the oldest translator of the King James Version, Hadrian Assaravia, who was 73 when he was selected. Born in France to Hispanic Flemish Protestants, that's Hispanic-Flemish parents who happened to be Protestants, Saravia had fled the religious disturbances of the lowlands for the island of Guernsey before becoming the master of Southampton Grammar School. Later, he became rector at Tattenhill in Staffordshire. He was one of the first ministers to write on the topic of preaching the gospel in foreign countries, and he was a favourite of King James and Bancroft because... Anybody? Anybody know? Why he was a favourite of King James? You at the back? Yes? That's right, he was. He was a what? All together now? He was an advocate of the divine right of kings. Okay, you guys are just going to have to forgive me for that one. I know it's a bit corny, but sometimes I can't help myself. Not long after the translation of the Bible began, his wife of 40 years died, and he married again not long after. The reason he was chosen for the job was because of his more general linguistic skills rather than any specific skills that some of the others possessed. One man chosen because he possessed a specific skill was Dr. John Layfield. Layfield was a Greek scholar, but he was chosen because he was also skilled in architecture, and he was greatly relied upon when it came to understanding the tabernacle and the temple. Now I'm going to point out here, again, this is the first Westminster Company, and their assignment is Genesis to 2 Kings, and we haven't yet come across a Hebrew specialist. Yet. Let's see if we can find one. I'm going to refer again to Opfel for our final 6 members of the first Westminsters, because not a lot is known about the last 4, so I think it'll be better to do it this way. So let's now turn again to Opfel. Lancelot Andrewes particularly enjoyed the linguistic skills of the 5th man on the panel, the scholarly William Bedwell, to whom he presented the vicarage of Tottenham, High Cross. Throughout his career, especially as Bishop of Ely, Andrewes continued to encourage Bedwell's studies, which extended to all the Oriental languages. Bedwell is best known, however, as the father of Arabic studies in England. He wrote a Persian dictionary, compiled an Arabic lexicon, and firmly believed that a knowledge of Arabic was important for an understanding of the exact sense of the Hebrew text. In a more practical sense, he stressed the importance of the Arabic tongue, which was the only language of religion and the chief language of diplomacy in an area from the Fortunate Islands to the China Seas. Even more, it was a language rich in medical and mathematical works. At the time he began working on the Bible, he was rector of St. Ethelburgh's in Bishopgate, London. Bedwell, who lived from 1562 until 1632, was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge. While there, he also occupied himself with mathematics. At the time, the connection between Arabic and mathematics was close, and it has been conjectured that his studies of numbers and symbols led him to Arabic. Over the years, he wrote many treatises, one of which explained the use of a special ruler, a mechanical contrivance for carpenters' calculations, invented by his uncle Thomas Bedwell, well-known mathematician and military engineer. Among the learned men at Westminster, the white-haired Saravia was not the only one of foreign birth. There was also Richard Thomson, nicknamed Dutch Thomson because he had been born in Holland to English parents. As a good Hebrew scholar, here we go, so the first mention of a good Hebrew scholar here. As a good Hebrew scholar, indeed hailed by some as a most admirable philologer, even better known in Italy, France and Germany than at home, he was most welcome at Andrewes' table. He had taken his bachelor's degree at Clare Hall, Cambridge in 1587 and held master's degrees from both Cambridge and Oxford. In 1604 he was a fellow of Clare Hall. For a time he lived under the protection of Sir Robert Killigrew, a diplomat known to history as a compounder of strong concoctions and potions. Surprisingly, for a man of the cloth, Thomson was a great interpreter of Martial, whose polished and witty epigrams were aimed at a depraved Roman society. Contemporary accounts further refer to Dutch Thomson as a drunken, a debauched English Dutchman who seldom went to bed one night sober. To be sure, his own king had a strong antipathy to water. James, in fact, had a penchant for sweet Greek wines. Among his subjects, ale was the favourite tipple, but a hardy drinker could also enjoy sack, beer, claret, Rhenish, cider, often mixed with spices. The bibulous Thomson probably paid little heed to Sir Hugh Platt's widely quoted recipe for preventing intoxication. Drink first a good draught of salad oil for what will float upon the wine which you shall drink, and suppress the spirits from ascending into the brain. Also, what quantity soever of new milk you drink first, you will drink thrice as much wine after. Thomson is reputed to have believed in the heretical doctrines of Jacobus Arminius, the Dutch Reformed theologian. Overall, the Dean of St. Paul's also leaned toward the Arminian position, which disputed John Calvin's doctrine of predestination. Tolerantly overlooking Thomson's Arminianism and his tippling, Lancelot Andrewes, when Bishop of Ely, rewarded him with a living at Snailwell, Cambridgeshire, where the corpulent scholar died in 1613. Love the name of that place, Snailwell. Now, where do you come from, young chap? Oh, Snailwell. Oh, good-o. Less is known about the four remaining members of the First Westminster Company. Robert Tye, Archdeacon of Middlesex and Vicar of All Hallows, Barking, Lancelot Andrewes' home parish, was born in Lincolnshire. First a Trinity man at Cambridge, he migrated to Magdalen College, Oxford, and became recognised as another excellent linguist. Attending both universities frequently widened the way for more patronage and preferment. So that's why he may have done it, I think they're suggesting here. He died in 1616, leaving a widow Mary. Another translator here, Francis Burley, served as Vicar of Bishop's Stratford, Hertfordshire, rector of Thorley and of St. Benet's, Paul's Wharf. He had been a Watts scholar, the recipient of a scholarship established by Thomas Watts, an earlier Archdeacon of Middlesex. The scholarship outlined an elaborate code of duties: to declaim by heart in Latin or Greek some moral or political question, to write firm, to compose Latin and Greek epigrams, and finally to be well affected toward religion and the ministry ecclesiastical. Burley was also one of the first fellows of Chelsea College, so here's another Latin and Greek expert. As for Geoffrey King, He could count himself among those fortunate translators whose stars began to rise once they were committed to the Bible work. A Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, he was named Vicar of Horsham in Sussex in 1605, and Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge the following year, quickly succeeding two fellow translators, Robert Spalding and Edward Lively, in the post. Finally, Richard Clarke, Fellow of Christ's College, Cambridge, was one of 6 preachers at Canterbury and Vicar of Minster on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. For a vicar like Clarke, £50 a year was a good stipend, often supplemented if he could look after more than one church. Unfortunately, lay patrons usually took the tithes, and a vicar was dependent on pittances from them. But in the town the parson was a figure of respect, and caps were doffed when he walked on the street. His duties were not onerous: 2 Sunday services, baptisms, weddings, catechising children, churching women after childbirth, that's saying prayers over them. In conferences with the church wardens, he also had to worry about the church repair. Later, Clarke became rector of Snargate and vicar of Monkton Combe, a hamlet close to Bath. His pulpit style sounds almost modern. I pardon the word atheist. The heart atheist that saith God is, but thinks it not, and lives accordingly, ungodly, unrighteously, unsoberly, his sin is greater than his hypocrisy. Clarke's sermons were his only published work. Dying in 1634, he left a bequest to Christ's, where his sons, James and Martin, had also taken degrees. Such, then, was the Westminster Hebrew group, a mix of old and young, busy deans and archdeacons, a prebendary, vicars, rectors, professors, a saint and a hearty tippler, working individually and then in committee to discuss the portion each had altered. As Gustavus Payne puts it, the company presided over by Lancelot Andrewes could sit down in a stone room by the fire and discuss in placid, capable fashion the books of the Bible they were to translate. One wonders, however, if calm could have been maintained when Overall's wife was running away with her lover and tongues were wagging all over London. But after the forgiving Dean took back his naughty Anne, tranquillity no doubt quickly returned to the biblical undertaking. Just while we're here, I might just read this other part from Opfellas as well. The first Westminster group reportedly met in the famous Jerusalem chamber, which was part of the original Abbey House and used for meetings of the Dean and Chapter. But already in 1605, Andrewes resigned his deanship to be consecrated Bishop of Chichester, one day before the powder treason was discovered. Remember, the 5th of November? That's the gunpowder plot. The Abbey Library has been suggested as a likely meeting site, although it may not have been properly fitted up at the time. Howard Nixon, the present Abbey Librarian, so that's present at the time of the writing of this book, which is, Opfells is a few years old now, but it's the best for this topic, in my humble opinion. Howard Nixon, the present Abbey Librarian, points out that there was at least one room, if there were not 2 rooms, in which a committee of 10 might have worked. The new bishop, who resigned as rector of St. Giles and master of Pembroke, now occupied a townhouse in the parish of St. Martin's within Ludgate. Here he lived the greater part of the time, and perhaps the scholars held some meetings within its rooms. Now, there are no exact records of the first Westminster Company's work, other than, of course, the outcome. As we go through the other companies in upcoming episodes, we will examine as much as we know about any specifics. Also, please remember I have a number of episodes planned where we will discuss thoroughly the process and the outcome of the work. But for now, let's have a very small taste of the first Westminster Company's work. Returning again to Opfel, and note here also the emphasis on previous English versions of the Bible. I think I mentioned that somewhere earlier, but I think it's of note. In all the work, liberal borrowings were made from earlier English Bibles. As Charles Butterworth says in The Literary Lineage of the English Bible, each one had entered into the making of the one that came after it, and was improved with it, thus transmitting its own influence down the whole line of descent. According to Butterworth, the chief formative influence on the Westminster Company's rendering of the Pentateuch was Tyndale, the second, the Geneva Bible, the third, Coverdale, in his 1535 version and in the Great Bible, and lastly, the Bishop's Bible. Tyndale began the book of Genesis with stark simplicity. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The earth was void and empty, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the water. This was to appear in the King James Bible as the more rhythmical, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." In this case, however, Lancelot Andrewes and his compeers followed the wording of the Geneva Bible almost exactly. "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters." The double insertion of the phrase, "the face of," is but one example of how, as Andrew Graham says, the translation was arrived at by a precise weighing of minute particulars. A few chapters beyond, the Westminster men dropped one of Tyndale's lively and charming words. Tyndale, "Then said the serpent unto the woman, Tush, ye shall not die." King James, "And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die." So you see the word there dropped was tush. In other books, Joshua through 2 Kings, Butterworth finds that the First Company was most influenced by the Matthew's Bible containing Tyndale's work, especially the narrative portions. Next, by the Great Bible, that's Coverdale's work, and the Geneva Bible. As Brooke Westcott observed, the simple narratives offer little scope for striking variations. From Taverner and the Bishop's Bible, Andrews and Company borrowed lesser touches. The Wycliffe Bibles left slight vestiges. But as Butterworth declares, they were not going to be bound while they might be free. Some of their most beautiful and original phrasing occurs in 1 Kings 19, verses 11 to 12. "And he said, Go forth, and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice." Okay, so I hope that just gives you a little taste of some of their work. And as I've said a couple of times now, we will go into that process and outcome far deeper in upcoming episodes. Well, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for listening. God bless, and hooroo.